Hey everyone, so over in the Discord there's been some confusion on the enhanced input system included with 5.1 and essentially what happened with the old system that Epic used to include. Basic rundown is the old system is now deprecated, so it's being removed, so you don't add inputs from project settings anymore, and instead you have a whole bunch of files that you need to set up, and this is what's causing the confusion. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how enhanced input system works, how you can use it or kind of understand it. And then towards the end, I'm going to wrap up and I'll show you how I'm utilizing the enhanced input system to allow for controller switching and different input modes or movement methods that I'm using in the VR template. So the first thing I'm going to do is boot up the VR virtual reality template by Epic. And the reason I'm using the VR template is because I've got my Vive set up and it's got some inputs on here that we can use. And then we can go through there and show you how to set up some button presses. So once that loads, we will jump right in. So now that we're in and it's all loaded up, we can go to our VR template and then we have an inputs folder. And this is pretty much where everything lives for our inputs. So if we start off in actions, we can go through these. The basics of actions are they're little, basically our headers. These are what we see inside of our blueprints. So we would call input IA underscore grab right. And we can see that if we open up our blueprints. So be a pawn. And we bring that over to the other screen once it loads. There we go. We can see here we've got IA grab left and grab right. So these are what we call in here. So let's say you wanted something that does, it's not in this, so we can do a jump. So we would right click and we could go to input. We would create an input action. This input action would be IA underscore jump. We hit enter and then we can open it up. What we want in here is this is the options of what our input's going to contain. Like what is our input going to do? And because it's a jump, it's essentially a bool. So it means it's an on-off value. You could switch to float. So let's say you've got a trigger and when you pull it, we can track between 0 and 1 how far through the pull it is. You could do stuff like that. So axis 1D would be triggers, that kind of thing. We want to keep consume input as it is. And we don't really need to do anything for triggers or modifiers. For now, that's fine. And what we could do is add an action description. In this case, it could be called jump. Now, what we would do here is you can see that we can't add any actual controller inputs, so it won't communicate. So in this case, we would go back to our folders. We would go back to inputs, and this is where we'd start looking at our input mapping contexts. So the best way to think about input mapping context is essentially groups of inputs for what you want something to do. So in our actually default would be a good one. So in default, this is our default player controllers. When we start, our VR pawn is going to take our default inputs and it's going to use those that we can control. So if we open it up and we drop down mappings, you can see everything that we need for our player to do on start is available here. So IA move, turn, grab left, grab right, menu toggle, and menu toggle right. This is essentially everything that our player is going to do when our game begins. And we can see that here. So if we scroll up to the top, we can see that in our VR pawn, we have our begin play. And then after we get our set tracking origin and our execute console command, we now call our add mapping context. So this is probably where things get a little bit more confusing because you need to assign inputs. But we can see here that it's as simple as get player controller, enhanced input local player subsystem, and then we add mapping context. So what we're doing here is we're saying on begin play, we're going to give our player these controls of IMC default, which is the ones that we read in this input. And what that does is it allows us to enable or disable certain inputs in projects. And unlike previously, we can actually control C and control V and use different inputs at the same time. So you can see how you can kind of utilize this to be a lot more powerful. And what we do here as well is in our IMC default, we also add our hands. So like I was saying, they're basically groups. We have our VR pawn that controls everything in here. And then we also have our hands, which we could then enable or disable. And we can see those in our IMC hands. We then have a menu, weapon left, and a weapon right. And these essentially add, or these are basically what we want to enable and disable. So we kind of want the control over them. So if we open up default again, you can see that we can open these up, and this is now where we add our inputs. So our controller inputs. So let's say we want to add jump. We could add a mapping here in our default, because once our player starts, it's going to be by default, it's going to be enabled. So we're going to search for our jump in the drop down. Let's search jump. And now we can go through and we can add our inputs. So I have my Vive added to the project. Let's do right A. If it's going to let me. And I do not have my Vive. It is a Valve index, so I'm in the wrong place. So right A pressed, we can call that. And because we've added it to our default, it means inside of our VR pawn, we're already adding it. And to be honest, we could add it even if we didn't have the default, which would allow us to enable it later on. So we can right click and then we search input action underscore jump. And you can see at the top here, we've got input action jump. We can call this. And now this is where it can get a little bit more complex as well. And what this does is each input action has different variables attached to it. So triggered is fired when we pull the trigger or we press the button and hold it down. So it's continuous. Started will fire once when we first press the button or at any stage that the input's being activated. Ongoing is is it still being pressed or processed? Cancelled, have we used something else to cancel the input? And then completed as it is, have you released and then gone from there. So in this case, you would do started, and then you would activate jump. We don't have anything to do that, so we'll do print string. And we can say jump started. Now if we hop into the headset and we boot up, it's going to crash. Be right back. So if we do that again, we can hit compile and we can jump in. We can then press our A button, and we can see in the top left there, right there, that we get our input when we press our A button. So that's adding inputs to an existing mapping context. So input mapping context, we're adding inputs directly to one of these already. But what happens if we want to add a new one? Let's say we have a new movement method called smooth locomotion, which I will be doing a video on, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. What we want to do is we want to right click and input action, input mapping context. And like I said before, this is basically a group to contain all the inputs that you need for an action to happen. So IMC underscore smooth locomotion, and then we can hit enter. So if we open this up, you see that we can add our mapping context. We can only add one at a time, which is something to keep out, but we need something that allows us to use our player and our character as normal. So what we could do is we can go through grab left, grab right, and then we have our hands, which are controlled by our other group. We've got jump, we've got input action turn, and then we would want something for move forward and move back. So in this case, what we do is we could have a new input action. So input action underscore move forward. And in this, we're going to make this a axis 1D because it's only moving forwards. It's going a positive to a negative. So we'll have float, and we'll say move forward. It's worth noting that this action description cannot be repeated. I had a problem where my description inside of my input mapping contexts were duplicated and it was causing a crash. So make sure these are separate to what other inputs are. So action description is its own thing, and input mapping context description is its a unique thing as well. So we created an input action for forward. We can duplicate that, and we'll say move sideways over that way. So we got both of those, and now in our smooth locomotion we can add our move forward and our move back. Not move back, let's move sideways. If I spell it right, move sideways. So here is where you can go through and you can set up your inputs, which we've already shown. If I bring over a project that I've been working on, so if you've seen the VR template I've been developing, I'm going to show you the project on there. So I'll show you the inputs for the smooth locomotion system that I've got set up. So we'll quickly take a look at this, and then we'll move back if I can drag it over. And you can see here that I've got a whole bunch of other groups and inputs available to the user. So smooth locomotion, if I open this up, you'll see the type of inputs that I'm including. So we got move forward, horizontal, grab left, grab right, sprint, jump, snap, turn, toggle menu, and toggle menu right. And if we open these up, you can see I've gone through and added all those inputs. So this is essentially where it gets added. And that allows you to interact with them and add them to your project. So rather than going through and adding everything, I'm just again going to add our jump. And then we'll call this, we will use valve index, right a pressed. And we'll keep that as it is. Because what I want to do is I want to show you that if we change our input mapping context inside of our VR pawn, so we're not using IMC anymore for default, we're now using smooth locomotion. When we hit compile and we press play, and we jump into the scene, when we press the button, nothing happens, even though we have that jump attached to our print string still. So the question is, why is it that we've assigned smooth locomotion, but this input action isn't firing? I think this is where the most confusing part comes in, is inside of our VR template, if you've had a look in the action folder, or the input folder, you'll see we have a player mappable input config. And what this does is essentially tells the editor, or Unreal in your game, which one of these input mapping contexts should be included with it. So if we open this up, we can see here that we have our context, and we have default, our menu, weapon left, weapon right, and hands. These are all being used in the VR template right now. So you wouldn't need to change it, and that's why, because adding the new jump function or jump input to our default worked, because it exists here. So what we do is we could add our smooth locomotion to this now. So we do drop down, smooth locomotion, that's now included. And just so you know where this exists, if you go to project settings, it's actually easier to search all settings and then search enhanced. You'll see that we've got some options here for it. So we have default editor input class, enhanced player input, default player input class, enhanced player input, and then enhanced input component. They'll be set to default, you don't need to worry about those. But you'll see in plugins, OpenXR input, we have our player mapping input for VR template. And that's the one that we just added our groupings to essentially. So you need to make sure it is in your project settings. And you can find this one specifically down in OpenXR input. And then you could make sure you've added it here. So it'll allow you to switch it out if you needed to. But in most cases, you can just add all of your contexts, input mapping contexts into this file. So in here, we've got numbers as well. These are kind of like priorities. So what you can do is you can have multiple input mapping contexts that use the same input. So you saw in default we have our jump, and then in smooth locomotion we also have jump inputs. If we had these enabled at the same time inside of our VR phone, so if we had add mapping context and that was duplicated and set up so we're using both, let's say smooth, and we set that back to default, then we need a priority. So one of these would have to take priority over the other to stop the inputs misfiring. So that's what that will do there. I believe, I'm pretty sure it is. So the lower the number, the higher the priority. And then as you go through, you would get that input there. But in our case, you would typically remove the default and probably switch it with smooth locomotion. Or add your smooth stuff to the default. It's up to you how you go. But what that does now is, now that we've added our jump to that file, so to our player mappable input config, we can then press play. And then if we press the A button now, we can see that now it jumps. So run down. You have actions, which are the name of all the things that you want your buttons to do. So it's jump, grab, scroll, slide, aim, reload. Oh god. Open menu, interact with UI, that kind of thing. Anything that your player is going to do, you'd have an action for it. And that action is going to be either a bool or a float. So you can see here, grab left, because it uses a 0 to 1. It actually uses axis 1D. But if it's a button, it's going to be a grab. So once you've got your input action set up, you can then go to inputs. You can either add them to an existing input mapping context, or you can create a new one by right-clicking and going to input, and then input mapping context. So once you've done that, you can go inside of that mapping context and add in all of your mappings. So you'd add your action and then your inputs for that action, and then make sure they're added to the actual player mappable input config so you can access them. One thing I didn't go over is about removing enhanced inputs. So we have our smooth locomotion set here, but let's say we wanted to change that to a different movement type. We could actually tell Unreal to remove this and replace it with the new one. And what that'll do is it'll immediately remap all of your controls to match whatever controls you have in here. So inside of the gun, which already exists, we can open up the pistol, and you can see here we have our inputs. So when our grab component is grabbed, so on component grab, we enable input for the player. So we say, okay, this blueprint can get our inputs. And from here, we choose if we're using the left or right hand, and we say get weapon left or weapon right, which we then add to our mapping context. So if we grab with our left hand, it will use the left input mapping context, and it will add it to our gun. So we can then call those input actions. In this case, it's shoot left. And we do a double check to make sure that we're holding the gun with our left hand. And then we go through and fire it. Once we release the object, so on drop, we disable the player input, and then we remove the mapping context back out. So as you remember, you've got priority options. So you don't want your mapping context to stay attached to an object that you're interacting with if it's going to override something else. But because this, you can add and remove them, you can switch this around. So that's the basic rundown of input mapping context and enhanced input system. So what I'm going to show you by closing this project, and I'll open up the VR project that I've been working on. So if you're part of Patreon, you'll have already seen this. And I'm going to show you how I'm using it to allow switching for real-time movement options. So we've already taken a look at enhanced input system, how to use it. And in the VR template, So if I scroll back, we have a menu. And you see here, I've got options to choose what kind of movement method we want to use. So I've got a flying option. I've got smooth locomotion and teleport, shift movement, and then teleport, which is kind of the default, but it was renamed. So if we open up our flying, you'll see here I've got an input action for flying forward, flying horizontal, flying up, down, snap, turn right, grab left, and grab right. And this is kind of the same thing through all of these groups. So when we're using smooth locomotion, we only want to be able to use these input actions. Whereas I've got smooth locomotion and teleport, which has the teleport input actions onto it as well. So if I bring these side by side, we can see how we've got them lined up here. And the only difference is literally this added the teleport. So what we can do is, or at least how I'm doing it, inside of our blueprints, I have a VR character. And ignore all this, it is a work in progress. We've got our movement graph. And at the top here, we have options to rejig our mapping context, essentially. So what I've done is, if you've seen any of the other videos, I have a data asset, which allows me to choose what movement type I'm using. And then I have a actual array as well inside of my player. So this array contains all of my mapping contexts of what the player has available to them. So in this case, there's 5 different movement options. And we go through that array and we check to see if it's similar to one that we've already got. So movement type, if it's equal to our movement type, we can say true, and we can add that mapping context to our player. If it's not, then we remove it. So simply refiring this section allows me to change through each one of these inputs to fire it in real time. So if we jump into the project, so now that we're in, what we can do is we can use our smooth locomotion option, and then we could say movement, let's say switch to teleport. So now I can't actually move, but my rotation's changed to my left hand, and now I can teleport around. Let's say I change to shift movement. We can then use that one. And we're basically remapping all the controls. So my control for snap turn is on the left controller, but if I go to smooth locomotion, it's now on the right. And then I can move around. I do teleport and have that. So that's pretty much the benefit of this, is being able to add and remove inputs and mappings as you need them. And it allows you for more dynamic control over your project and where to use them. So I'm trying to think if we've got anything else in here that could be useful to show. Input contexts. Not really. We've got our table mappable input config, and you can see that I've added those in here as well. So the project knows what to use. And then input actions, I've got them all stored in this folder. So that's pretty much it. It's a little bit in-depth, hopefully, but kind of repetitive as well. I'm hoping that it just gets across what it is you need to do, and that it's actually pretty easy. The best thing you can do is, if you're stuck, is to just check out some of the blueprints that are already in the VR template, such as the weapon, which shows you how to add and remove them, and then just play around with the player controller or the VR character to see how that goes and how the inputs are working on there. Add, remove, play around, that kind of thing. So yeah, before I end it, I just want to say a big thank you to all Patreons who have made this possible, especially this plugin that I've been working on. So if you want access to this and you want to try it around, fly around, that kind of thing, then definitely check it out. If you need any help with enhanced inputs and you're not too sure where to go, got a link in the description for our Discord server, which we're almost at 2,000 people. So if you need any help, head on over there and we'll be able to give you a hand. But yeah, all right. Until next time, stay safe and I'll see you then. Bye.